So what we decided for today, what we want to do is really to talk about securing financial workforce with strong authentication. As you know, and as you would have heard in the news a couple of times now, making stories and headlines are companies that are in for the wrong reasons in the news, companies that would potentially have lost data purely because their workforce aren't sufficiently protected, or the data isn't sufficiently protected through a protected workforce. So we thought it's an opportune time to really have a discussion around, what makes strong authentication. Why is things like a password simply not cutting it any longer? Why is it that you would look at alternative measures to really look at in protecting your data and protecting your workforce? So Alan, thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking some time off to have this discussion. It really is an open discussion around, what are the things that we are plagued with, things that we need to really look out for, and how we can really help an organization or a customer protect the environment a little bit more, a little bit better, so that the malicious entities would rather look at their competition and try and attack them instead of themselves, if they have all the necessary and proper solutions in place, obviously, of course. So maybe to start off with the discussion, there's been a couple of breaches that I've just mentioned or spoken about, but maybe let's just go a little bit deeper into what are those breaches that has happened.
Okay, thanks, Eamon. So one of the big ones that's obviously very relevant to South Africa is the Experian data breach. So this was about 24 million records of South African citizens lost by Experian. And that happened by a fraudster actually posing as a legitimate client. So they contacted Experian, they got all the data, and they managed to siphon all this data off. The real problem there is that Experian should really have had measures in place to make sure somebody posing as a legitimate client really was a legitimate client. So they should have had those checkpoints in place. And they just didn't. So that's 24 million records of South African citizens, which is a huge problem for Experian as an organisation. And the boardroom discussions tend to be at the level of there's an increasing level of fines. I know, being from Europe, we have GDPR, where we have an increasing level of fines. That's data protection regulations. I know you have something similar with POPI in South Africa. And that really comes down to, if you're not doing what you should, if you're not following best practice to protect your data and protect yourself, the level of fines is going up. So that's hugely important at the boardroom level. But it's also the reputational damage. As you said, these are in the news. Nobody wants to be in the news for those reasons. It's for a firm that's job is to protect data and provide data, that's not what they want. And the final one is just the ongoing ability to do business. There is a huge cost after you've had one of these data breaches. Just to pick another example, Marriott, for example, Marriott Hotels, they lost about 5.2 million records of their people who visited their homes, or all the information they lost. And that was two hackers actually managed to steal the credentials of employees and get in and start accessing the data. We're not quite sure whether that was by credential stuffing, so that's whether you've got some passwords you've bought on the dark web and you've played them in, or whether it's phishing or spear phishing, so they're deliberately targeting, trying to steal records. The scary piece is, once they've got those records, they were inside the system for a month before it was noticed. So start to think, what could those bad actors do within my system within that 1 month? In this case, they stole 5.2 million records, but they could have been planting malware, ransomware, all sorts of things. So it is absolutely a big problem, and the question is not, should I protect myself, but what's the best way to do it?
Sure. And I think it's quite scary to know that your personal data are now out there, and anybody can actually virtually get access to it and don't have a problem with it. Whereas before, you knew it would have been protected. You trusted entities, you trusted companies to ensure that your data remains safe. After all, it's your personal data, and all of a sudden, it's as simple as going onto the internet, and you can find your data there, and it's personal data. So, and I think
Yeah.
that's sort of a wake up call for any person to see. All of a sudden, here's my data out there. It's people that I trusted, and despite all the systems that they have in place, um, people still manage to get information. So it's clear that it's actually now moved quite a lot from trying to penetrate through a firewall and doing things like that, all sorts of funny things. Now it's really just the people have caught on, the malicious entities have really caught on to say, hold on, it's so much easier. I can just target people. And it really comes down to identities and credentials. It's not really about firewalls and those things anymore. The hardware. It's really about.
No, you're absolutely right. It's moved on from keeping the bad guys out to how do I let the good guys in. It's a slightly different mind shift. So especially in the worlds of COVID and more remote working, people accessing systems from homes and different IP addresses that people aren't used to. It really does come down to that. Is it the right person? Very, very much like Marriott and Experian, you need to have something in place that says, is this person claiming legitimate access to my data? Are they who they claim to be, and should they have it? And that comes on to the really starting to look into where the problem is and what's the main thing to focus on. So most organizations have a number of back-end systems where somebody who legitimately is trying to access it has an account. So a bank, for example, they might have network access, remote access, Teams type of applications, payroll type applications, etc. And there's normally a real person who tries to access those accounts. That person then has a digital identity. So that typically is a one-to-one mapping between an account on a back-end system. So Alan.story intercede, for example, is me. And then there needs to be something in between that digital identity, which is the representation of the person in that digital world, and the system they're trying to access. And that's a credential. So that could be a password, it could be a smart card, it could be a YubiKey token, it could be a one-time credential and an RSA token. All of these things are credentials. And the bad actors trying to attack these systems will look at the weak point. Where's the easiest place for me to get in? It's relatively difficult for me to get in and create accounts on back-end systems because I need to be already inside the system and have admin accounts to do that. The weak point in the chain is that credential. So if I can guess, steal, reuse, learn somebody's credential, I can then in effect become that person and I can get inside the system. And that's the real point that the attackers are going after. So you mentioned there's lots of data out there that you can buy on the dark web and you can use. Frighteningly enough, a lot of that information is passwords. So you can actually get those passwords and then you can just try replaying them systems until you get a hit.
Crazy. So, okay, so we now really know that there's a problem. We know that where the problem lies and how easy it is to get access. What's the impact really? Maybe just take us quickly through what the impact has been on some of these breaches. So that we can just really understand it's not just something that's sitting out far. It's really something that's very close to us.
No, absolutely. So there are some pretty scary numbers out there. So there was a large study done by Verizon, specifically saying that 81% of these data breaches were caused by passwords. There tends to be different numbers between about 70 and 85%, but normally they come at about 3/4 of those data breaches. But there's also been some very specific studies, as he's saying, on the cost. So IBM did a study over a 9-month period in South Africa, looking at the average cost of a data breach to an organization. And that came in at 40.2 million rand. That looks like a scary number, and I know sometimes when I speak to people, they go, well, that's just nonsense, that's too big, that's just Interseed inventing numbers to scare people. But the reality is that was a study where they'd actually spoken to people who'd been subject to a data breach, and they asked the end organizations what was the cost. this wasn't somebody making it up. This was accountants in the end organization saying, okay, well, potentially there's a fine, but even if not, there's a cost to actually change the security measures. There's a cost to inform all the people, a cost to put short-term and long-term fixes in, a cost to update the data. So these are real figures from real organizations. So it can be a huge cost, just a financial cost, regardless to the reputational damage. And the bit that actually scared me the most from this study was that the average time it took, and again, this is from a real world study of people who've been subject to that breach, before they found out they had been breached, was 177 days. So these people are inside your system for an average of 177 days before you even know it's happened. The horse has bolted by then. The data's out there. You've lost the information. It's quite worrying.
So for half a year, you as a company might not even realize your data has been lost, and it has gone off with it. So I think that is quite scary, and it's also scary to know that as an organization, you can probably stop to exist purely because you did not manage to protect your data sufficiently by applying all measures possible to ensure that the data remains inside the organization and is only allowed to be accessed by people that is really entitled to it. And I think that's the scary story. Thank you for sharing that with us. I think that is quite insightful.
Yeah, and I think the obvious place then is to, yes, it's a problem. What's the biggest cause of the problem? And it is that weak credential. It is that password. So most organizations are looking at, how do I get rid of that weak credential?